this is the most remarkable story. You've basically lived through daily terror and hell for years. My first question I have to ask is about your Jewishness.
Yes.
The fact that you grew up in an observant home, to me, what makes the generation of those that went through the Holocaust the greatest generation is that there doesn't seem to be, despite all the terror you had to go through because of who you were as a Jew, how is it that you don't resent your Jewishness?
Well, to be honest with you, it may be a bit difficult to condense it into 1 minute, but I'll try and be very quick. In the camps, I didn't give God a thought. I was a little boy. I stopped going to school when I was not 9 yet. My father left me to flee to England before I was 9. And I had gone to a Jewish school, which I told you was sort of very mildly Jewish. It was attended by Jewish pupils, but the curriculum was primarily secular, with very little Jewish knowledge. I could read Hebrew, I knew the alphabet, but I didn't really have lectures on Judaism, so I was quite ignorant. When I reached the UK in September 46, my father, despite all his trials and tribulations through the war, had retained his Yiddishkeit. He came from a very Orthodox family and he'd spent 4 years in yeshiva as a young man. And he expected me sort of to join him. Well, he asked me to wear kippah. He got me a pair of tefillin, which I'd never put on, although I had this bar mitzvah I spoke about in the camps. We didn't have any tefillin because these Riga Jews, they couldn't take the Sifrei Torah with them, but tefillin they put into their pockets when they left. We didn't find any spare ones. So I did everything giving the appearance of being a young observant man. But in my head, once I began to understand some of our prayers, that in our prayers we consider God to be just and merciful, that didn't make sense to me. After my experience, I couldn't imagine how we can address God as merciful nor just after what I'd seen during the war. So I didn't have the heart to break my father's heart, so I didn't say anything, but it was internal turmoil. Outwardly I was practicing, but internally it didn't make sense to me. Well, I didn't know how to handle this, but as I began to mature, I began to realize that we experience miracles around us. We just accept them and don't think about them. I learned about the miracle of birth. It began to strike me the seasons of the year, how it all works like clockwork. We put seeds into the ground and food grows out. You look at fruit trees and how does one know to grow apples, another one grows pears and cherries. You look at the sun, and I had learned by then that if the sun was any closer, we would burn. If it was any further, we wouldn't be able to live here. So all these things, and there are hundreds of these things you can think about, effectively they're miracles. Science can't really explain nature. And what does nature mean? Is somebody has to organize nature. I realized that the world, the universe, is a tightly run, very complex mechanism which cannot be expected to run on its own. So I realized that, whether I believe it or not, that there must be a God, an eternal God around. But how could he allow such things to happen? But then it struck me that if that God is eternal, he must have an eternal mind. We are finite beings who live our 70, 80 years or so, and our minds are also finite. And I thought that the Holocaust, in my mind, is something unprecedented in human existence. And therefore, perhaps our minds are not able to digest it and appreciate and analyze it, because I haven't found anyone who has given any credible comment on the Holocaust as to why it happened. In fact, when I began to learn about Judaism, when I looked through, I had a rabbi who helped me, who taught me. I found out that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, who we consider to be the human being closest to the Almighty ever during our Jewish existence, he, despite that, pleaded with the Almighty to give him an insight into how God functions. And God said, impossible, my ways are not your ways. And that phrase struck me, and I decided that God knows what he's doing. His mind is able to think about things that are sort of not understandable from our perspective, and therefore we have to accept that God does not want us to understand if he hasn't given us the power to do so. And once I'd resigned myself to not being able to make sense of why this happened to us, I could believe in God and become a devout believing Jew, without understanding to this day why so many of us had to go through this and millions of us lost their lives. I still don't understand it, but I feel this is God's will. We are all God's creations, and we just have to accept it.
Wow.
Possibly we Jews believe in eternal life. Maybe in some later stage we will be granted some understanding of why this happened. And in that way I have lived my life as a devout and believing Jew.
Wow.